It started with a smirk. That smug, knowing look Jon Stewart gave, just as Karoline Leavitt sat down across from him, lights bright and cameras rolling. Millions were watching, expecting another knockout punch from one of America's most beloved satirists. But what unfolded wasn't a takedown, it was a revelation. And by the end, it wasn't Jon Stewart who was celebrated for his brilliance, it was her. Karoline had walked into the studio knowing exactly what was waiting for her. She'd read the headlines, too young, too right-wing, just a communications major. They questioned her legitimacy at every turn, but she was used to that. At 26, Karoline Leavitt had already climbed through a political world designed to shut women like her out. She wasn't from a dynasty. She didn't carry Ivy League credentials. What she had was grit and a degree from St. Anselm College that Jon Stewart would, unfortunately for him, choose to mock. So, Karoline, Jon began, the crowd already chuckling, you studied communications, right? I mean, shouldn't you be managing social media for a bakery instead of running for Congress? The laughter in the room spiked. Karoline paused, her smile unwavering but her eyes sharp. This was the moment. She could laugh it off, or she could do what she came to do. Well, Jon, she said smoothly, I studied communications, yes, and I suppose that's what allows me to see when someone uses their platform to talk down to people who didn't take the Ivy League route. The room hushed. Stewart tried to pivot, but Karoline leaned in. Let's talk about what a communications degree actually teaches, she continued, voice steady and strong. It teaches people to listen, to understand how to craft messages that resonate. It teaches the power of words, how they can uplift or destroy. And you know what? In today's world, that might be one of the most essential skills anyone can have. I used that degree to work in the White House. I used it to help build a campaign, and now I'm using it to represent people who feel unseen, unheard, and yes, the crowd was quiet now. Eyes widened. Jon blinked, caught off guard, searching for the humor that had vanished from the room. Karoline didn't stop there. You think a degree defines someone's worth? My mother didn't go to college, but she raised me to believe that humility, hard work, and courage mattered more than any diploma's prestige. Are we really going to tell the millions of Americans without elite credentials that their voices don't count? That their experiences are punchlines? Stewart leaned back, visibly reconsidering his stance, and the audience, they started to nod. Karoline then did something unexpected. She acknowledged Stewart's legacy. You made a career exposing hypocrisy, challenging the powerful, but sometimes even good men forget what it's like to be underestimated. I haven't, not for a second. The shift in energy was undeniable. What began as a setup for ridicule became a masterclass in dignity under fire. Karoline wasn't angry. She was focused, controlled. And in that clarity, she reminded everyone watching that intelligence isn't exclusive to the halls of Harvard. Sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one brave enough to say what others won't. After the show, social media exploded. Clips of Karoline's response spread like wildfire. People from all walks of life, teachers, single moms, veterans, first-generation college students, shared her words. She had struck a chord that transcended party lines, not because of what degree she had, but because of what she stood for. Jon Stewart, to his credit, issued a quiet apology days later in a podcast, admitting that perhaps he'd forgotten what it was like to be young, ambitious, and dismissed. And though the apology mattered, what mattered more was the conversation Karoline had forced into the light. Because in that moment, live on national TV, Karoline Leavitt didn't just defend her degree, she defended every overlooked underdog who had ever been told they weren't enough. By the end of the week, her campaign donations doubled. Invitations poured in from networks, universities, even critics who wanted to talk to the woman who had schooled Jon Stewart. But Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't dance on victory. She went back to work, door to door, town to town, still using the same voice she always had. Clear, powerful, unapologetically real. And that is where the story leaves us. Not just with a viral clip or a clever comeback, but with a reminder that your value isn't stamped on a degree, it's proven in your courage. It's shown in your resilience. And sometimes the most important education isn't about where you studied, it's about who you choose to be when the world tells you to sit down and be quiet. In an age where television debates often devolve into rehearsed sound bites and ideological shouting matches, one moment of authenticity can pierce through the noise. One such moment came unexpectedly during what was supposed to be a routine appearance for rising political figure Karoline Leavitt. Known for her sharp conservative views and youthful charisma, Karoline entered Jon Stewart's show prepared for confrontation. But what she achieved was much more than a rebuttal. It was a defining moment of self-worth, resilience, and the dismantling of elitism. Jon Stewart, a revered figure in political satire, built his legacy by dismantling powerful institutions through humor. He brought a generation into political consciousness through his trademark mix of wit and truth. But on that evening, it wasn't his usual opponent, a corrupt system or a dodging politician. Instead, it was a young woman with a less than impressive degree in communications, someone he assumed would be easy to laugh off. The setup was classic Stewart, sarcasm laced with a jab. "You went to St. Anselm College, right? Studied communications?" he said, eyebrows raised, smile forming. The crowd chuckled as if on cue. He was leading them into the joke, into the space where he traditionally skewered his guests with an air of intellectual superiority. But what happened next stunned the room and the country. Karoline didn't flinch. Her calm demeanor remained unchanged, but the fire behind her eyes intensified. She didn't laugh nervously. She didn't try to pivot. She leaned into the moment with courage and conviction, exposing not only the flaw in Stewart's mockery, but the broader cultural tendency to equate institutional prestige with intelligence and youth with ignorance. "Yes," she said with steady poise, "I studied communications, and I suppose that's what allows me to recognize when someone uses their platform to punch down on people who didn't follow the Ivy League path." In that sentence alone, Karoline flipped the entire power dynamic. She wasn't playing defense. She reframed the narrative and took control of the conversation. She didn't just defend herself. She became the voice for millions of Americans who had walked a non-traditional path, who felt sneered at by coastal elitism and media gatekeeping. What made the moment so poignant wasn't just the words, but the context. Karoline Leavitt wasn't an anomaly. She represented a growing demographic of young leaders who weren't born into legacy networks or elite circles, but who built their platforms through determination, faith, and a deep connection to the average American. She brought to the stage the working class values of grit and integrity, values often ridiculed or dismissed in highbrow political commentary. The double standard of elitism and gender, there was an unspoken double standard beneath Stewart's mockery, one that revealed the intersection of gender, age, and class. Would a young man have been mocked for a communications degree? Would a Harvard or Princeton graduate be treated with the same condescension if they shared Karoline's views? The truth is, society often applies harsher scrutiny to ambitious young women, especially those who hold conservative beliefs. For Karoline, it wasn't just her politics that were under fire. It was her legitimacy as a qualified woman in a male-dominated political landscape. This is not new. Women have always been forced to prove themselves in ways their male counterparts rarely face. And when they do succeed, they are often reduced to their appearance, their age, or their educational background. Karoline wasn't just fighting back for herself. She was standing up for every woman who has been told she's too young, too loud, or too inexperienced. She reminded the audience that real intelligence is not only measured by where you went to school, but how you use your voice, how you carry yourself, and what you stand for when it matters most. The role of experience over credentials. One of the greatest myths in modern professional culture is that elite education equals superior qualification. While no one denies the value of academic rigor, there is a dangerous arrogance that often accompanies institutional privilege. Karoline's clapback wasn't just about personal dignity. It was about dismantling the illusion that people without Ivy League degrees don't have something meaningful to contribute. Her experience working in the White House and advising on national communication strategies demonstrated that what she lacked in brand name education, she more than made up for in action, outcomes, and results. The truth is, America was built by individuals who didn't have prestigious degrees, but had powerful dreams, relentless work ethics, and unshakable faith. Karoline's story was a modern reflection of that truth. She embodied the notion that sometimes experience from the real world is far more instructive than theories taught in a classroom. Her rise to political relevance wasn't handed to her. It was earned through sleepless nights, grassroots organizing, and a fearless willingness to speak truth, even when it wasn't popular. The power of humility and courage. What truly separated Karoline's response from the hundreds of political moments that cycled through media each week was her humility. She didn't retaliate with arrogance or defensiveness. She didn't stoop to Stewart's level. She used his comment as a teachable moment, not just for him, but for the entire audience. She acknowledged her background not with shame, but with pride. She spoke of her mother, who didn't go to college, yet taught her more about character than any professor could. She honored her roots without bitterness, and in doing so, she created a bridge between herself and millions of Americans who had been made to feel less than for their background, their jobs, or their education. Her courage, too, was unmistakable. Speaking truth to power is never easy, especially when that power comes in the form of a beloved television icon with a room full of laughter on his side. But Karoline didn't fold. She stood her ground, and in doing so, she flipped the script. The media fallout and public reaction within hours of the interview airing, social media erupted. Hashtags began trending. The clip was shared across political lines, not just among conservatives, but also among centrists and independents who found Karoline's message inspiring. Even some on the left praised her poise, calling her the most composed guest Jon Stewart's had in years. What happened next was a media op-eds, talk shows, podcasts. Everyone wanted to talk about Karoline Leavitt. But for her, the real victory wasn't media exposure. It was the messages she received from everyday people. Single mothers who had put themselves through night school. Veterans who had returned from service to start small businesses. Teachers, nurses, mechanics. People who had worked for everything they had, who had never once been on television, but who saw themselves in her. She had tapped into something real, something raw, and that, more than anything, proved her authenticity. A generation redefining power. Karoline Leavitt is part of a generation that is redefining what power looks like. In an age of performative activism and polished PR campaigns, her authenticity stood out. She didn't come from the right schools. She didn't have a last name that opened doors. What she had was a deep sense of purpose and a refusal to back down. Her story is a challenge to institutions that have long gatekept leadership positions. It's a wake-up call to a society that still puts more weight on a diploma than on values. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones no one saw coming. What this moment means for the future in a culture obsessed with credentials, prestige, and social media optics, Karoline Leavitt offered something refreshing: substance. Her composure in the face of ridicule, her commitment to representing the overlooked, and her ability to hold her ground with grace signals the kind of leadership the next generation desperately needs. She proved that you don't need to humiliate others to make a point. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard, and you don't need to come from power to change the game. All you need is the courage to speak your truth unapologetically, respectfully, and fearlessly. If you believe in the future, all you need to do is to hang in and find conclusion, redefining worth in a broken system. Karoline Leavitt's showdown with Jon Stewart wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural reckoning. It revealed the cracks in how we define intelligence and legitimacy. It exposed the subtle arrogance of media elites who equate value with institutional affiliation. And most importantly, it reminded us that real strength lies not in how loudly you speak, but in how deeply you believe. Her words resonated because they weren't just about her, they were about all of us. Every single person who's been told they're not enough, every woman who's been silenced in a meeting, every young person who's been told to wait their turn, every working class citizen who's been made to feel invisible. In that moment on live TV, Karoline Leavitt stood tall not just as a political figure, but as a symbol. A symbol that your past doesn't define your future, that your degree doesn't define your intelligence, that your roots don't limit your rise. She didn't just school Jon Stewart, she educated a nation.